Welcome to Conversations. My name is Rebecca Jorgensen-Sundquist, and I'm in charge of development work here. And this is a program that I started last fall. And today is the second gathering in what I'm calling an occasional series. I started Conversations because of the opportunity and the joy that I've experienced over 20 years of development work here at Norway House, listening to our founders who have shared their stories over many, many cups of coffee. And I've heard fabulous stories of career pathways to founding businesses, to running companies, to selling companies, to transitioning companies, the works. And stories that tell of hard work, risks that have been taken, creativity, strategies, wins, and losses. Their stories are fascinating to me, and I thought others might enjoy the conversation. I thought other business leaders and the entrepreneurs from Norway that we serve through our Barn program might be inspired and encouraged by our speakers. So these programs are an opportunity for us to honor those who have helped shape Norway House, our communities and beyond, and to give them a platform to share their journey. So you can think of it as the Barn program marries the development department, and it's a mashup, and we're calling it Conversations. So our first presenter last October was Norm Hagfors. Norm was the number 4 employee of Medtronic, and our October speaker this coming October will be Janet Dolan, who is the CEO of Tenor Corporation, and she's the founder of the Minnesota Peace Initiative here at Norway House. So more details to follow on that. But first, I'd like to introduce you to our Conversations team. Ask them to stand. It's Britt Articandi in the back there. James Farstead. James is a board member here at Norway House too. Susanna Ojo, who provided hospitality. Thank you, Susanna. And Ted Risdahl, who is not here today. So we have a great team, and we're having a lot of fun working on this. And if there are those of you who think you'd like to be a part of our team, let me know afterwards. We'd love to grow the team. I think it's most likely that no one needs an introduction about our speaker today. Kjell is the chairman and CEO of Borton Volvo and Borton Overseas. He's a native Norwegian, the retired Honorary Consul of United Republic of Tanzania. He's been a business owner for over 50 years and is a community, national, and international leader with a footprint on many continents. Honestly, Kjell, it's staggering how much you have accomplished. I think there must be 10 of you. And you're going to hear lots and lots of stories today from Kjell. But your energy, your enthusiasm, your passion, your insight have served so many, and Norway House is so grateful for your friendship. Lee Schaefer, our moderator today, is a St. Paul-based writer and business consultant. You probably know him best as the former business and economics columnist at the Star Tribune. I think you were there for 10 years, Lee. Lee was twice named the best business columnist by the Society of American Business Editors and Writers. A great award, Lee. Lee grew up on a cattle farm in southwestern Minnesota. He studied history and economics at Macalester. He received his master's degree from Northwestern. He worked as a writer and editor for a regional business monthly before returning to business investment banking and leading a business strategy consulting group. Lee has served on many community boards, and he volunteers at Twin Cities Habitat for Humanity, Neighborhood House, and Housing in Action. Lee is Norwegian. Let's welcome Kjell to start out the conversation, and then the gentleman will be seated at the soft seating, and Lee is going to pepper him with all kinds of interesting questions, and then we'll have at the end of that, we'll have opportunity to ask questions as well. Let's welcome Kjell Bergh.
Thank you. So I'm going to do two things. I'm going to start a timer to make sure I don't talk too long. And then I'm going to take out sort of a little written thing here for the same purpose. to make sure that we keep it within a time frame in which Lee can ask some probing, hard-hitting questions that we'll see where they go after that. And the reason I do that is simple. When I was asked to give this talk, I realized that there are a couple of reasons for it. One is that I'm old enough to have been around long enough to do some interesting things. And the other reality is that I've been incredibly fortunate to get involved with so much on several different continents. I visited all 7 continents, 5 in 1 week at one point. So I move around fairly fast, and I realized that it could come off as bragging, which is not my intent. I was asked to share my story in business and outside, and so that's what I hope to do. The slide that you see up there is in Oslo, downtown Oslo. I was 9 years old, and I started my business career as a Coke dealer. And the backstory there is that my father was chairman of the Norwegian Association of Landscape Contractors and Architects, and he was putting on this massive exhibit that's actually inside the greenhouse. And he asked me if I wanted to sell Coke, and it sounded good. So, yeah, and you'll see a little later as we go along here that there's a continuing story that connects with dealing Coke. When I had been in America for 13 months, went back to Oslo, started at University of Oslo, I became a truck driver for the Coca-Cola company in Oslo, the distribution. So I went from being a single vendor to being a distributor. So, but I had to watch it a little bit because when I tell people that my favorite drug of choice is Coke, I'm referring to Coca-Cola. So now recently I've switched to saying my favorite drug of choice is Pepsi, because it is less likely to find its way to the internet. So I came over. I had been fortunate enough to I have been drafted by the publisher of an Oslo newspaper when I was 15 to write some stories for the local newspaper. And it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And pretty soon I found myself working about 40 hours a week for the paper. And the sports editor, who was 10 years older than me, and importantly had a driver's license. I was not old enough to have a driver's license, which is at 18 in Norway, and said, "Why don't we start an automotive department together?" And there wasn't one like that in Norway. And as a result, the factories and the importers gave us free cars to drive and to write about. And I was in heaven because I couldn't afford a car and I didn't have a driver's license. And we conveniently neglected to tell Ford and General Motors and Volvo and Volkswagen. So he'd pick up the cars and we'd drive them. And I'd write half of the stories, he'd write the other. And by the time I turned 18, I said, "Now I have a license, so I can tell you." Fast forward, get to the United States. My brother had been a foreign student in Delaware, American Field Service, and introduced me to a family that were kind enough to invite me to come and stay with them for a while in Delaware. And I said, "That'd be great, but I have to make one stop in Detroit. I have an invitation to test drive the second year Ford Mustangs at the High Bank High Speed Proving Grounds in Detroit, Michigan, Dearborn." And I was in hog heaven, of course. At the end of the day, they threw me the keys and said, "Keep the car for a month." So I said, "Well, I'm going to go all over the United States." And I said, "It's okay, do whatever you want." So I had a brand new Ford Mustang Fastback at no cost. Loved it. So I love this country. And my chances of ever returning to Norway permanently were dimming rapidly. But after 13 months, I did go back, University of Oslo, Coca-Cola, bored to death, came back to the United States, to visit my brother, who had married the gal from Sioux Falls, and they were living here then. And both of them were at the University of Minnesota. And he said, "What are you doing next?" I said, "I want to go to Seattle and write some stories about the Scandinavian community." And he said, "Nah, stay right here. Get yourself a job that supplements your income." And so I went to an employment agency in Richfield and took a whole bunch of tests. And the owner of the B&B employment agency said, "You can have any job you want." So I said, "Well, I don't want an important job. I just want to be here for 9 months. And then I got to go back and do my military service in the Norwegian Air Force." And he said, "Well, go and look at some of these options. You want to run a department store?" I said, "No, not qualified." "And do you want to run a photography company?" "No, not qualified." "Do you know anything about cars?" I said, "I happen to know a lot about cars." He said, "Can you sell them?" I said, "I have no idea. The only thing I've sold is Coke." Yeah. So I said, "Well, go see Oscar Borton at 38th and Nicollet," which was in a real dicey neighborhood in South Minneapolis. And Oscar hired me on the spot, didn't sell a car for 30 days. On the 31st day, I sold three, and then I was off to the races and did very, very well. Oscar he was born on a homestead in Montevideo, Minnesota, to Norwegian immigrant parents. So at the end of the 90 days, I said, "Mr. Borton, it's been grand. I'm going back to Norway." He said, "No, that's not going to work." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, you got to buy this place." So I said, "Sir, that's seriously funny. I have $50. You could have it in cash or you could have it in installments, but that's what I got." That's what the banks are for. So he said, "I'll guarantee the loan." So what else? So I said, "Well, I don't live in this country." "Well, my parents didn't either. They emigrated. So can you." "What else?" I said, "I don't know anything about business." He said, "I didn't either, and you're smarter than me. You'll figure it out quickly." So I was out of objections. So I ended up spending $127,000, which was a lot of money 60 years ago that I didn't have. But he gave me 5 years to pay for it. I paid for it in three, and then I bought the Volvo Pontiac sub dealership in Rochester, Minnesota, started a limousine company, bought a travel company in Bonnie Boisner, who's general manager and president of Borton Overseas, which is that company, which has been in continuous operation since 1894. I bought that. And a few years later, Volvo, as we had made a pretty serious mark on the Volvo sales, invited me to build a dealership in Delray Beach, Florida. So I built two very large Volvo and Volkswagen dealerships on Federal Highway in Delray Beach. Both of them are still in the top 10 in the United States. And my partner, whom I brought down from Minneapolis, my junior partner, I lent him the money to buy a share in the company, had to have his own dealerships. So he bought me out, and I ended up moving back to Minnesota and uh, expanded as much as we could on South Lindale. And for those who aren't familiar with the location, I'd moved it there a year after I took over the company to get away from the high crime at 38th and Nicollet. We were directly across the street from Annunciation School for more than 40 years. So it turned out that crime existed other places in the universe as well. The city of Minneapolis was not particularly fond of car dealers, and they eventually managed to make life difficult enough so that it wasn't feasible for us to stay there. After a little more than 40 years, and I consolidated everything with our location in Golden Valley. And that has been a huge success. We're doing extremely well and keep expanding there. And we have about 8 acres of land there as opposed to less than 2 on Lindale. So we're in great shape. Of the other things that I've been involved in, and I'm delighted to see two of my former consular colleagues, Sylvia Antoneda and Ivan here, from my 15 years service as Honorary Consul for Tanzania. I had first gone to Tanzania in 1974. My first wife was from Tanzania and had come here as a foreign student. And we happened to befriend the Swedish Consul General and his wife. He called me up, says, I've been promoted. I'm the new ambassador to Tanzania, and you're coming to stay with us for 2 weeks. And I'd found my third home country. Absolutely fell in love with Tanzania. Fast forward a little more, ended up buying a safari lodge in Tanzania. I was looking for a house, couldn't find a house. So we bought a Tanzanian safari lodge in the Tarangire National Park. They had 500 bed nights, overnight visitors the year before we bought it. And within 3 years, we were at 17,000 visitors per year. Extremely successful. As part of my involvement with Tanzania, I had befriended the Tanzanian ambassador to the United States, Benham Kappa, who later went on to become foreign minister and then ultimately president for 10 years. And he used to, after he was elected president, he used to show up at my dealership, still on South Lindale from time to time. He said, I'd like to see Mr. Bergh. Can tell him who's here? Tell him Ben is here, president of Tanzania. And I said, okay, great. And we had very similar interests. I was a policy wonk. He was obviously a policy wonk. And so when he was at the United Nations giving speeches on behalf of Tanzania, he'd asked me to come to New York and spend 2-3 days with him. Then he'd call me up and say, okay, we have a meeting with a former UN ambassador, former ambassador to the United Nations, Andrew Young. And he said, I'd like to have you come and join the meeting in Atlanta. So I did, and I've since met privately with Andy Young on a couple of other occasions, as he had a big foundation in Africa. Then we got a call from the president again, and he said, my wife is coming to visit some friends in South Florida, and she has a foundation for kids that are disadvantaged in Tanzania. Could you put on a fundraiser for her? Well, we had just bought a house in Delray Beach, didn't know anybody except my employees and some customers. And so I said, who can we work with here? So someone said, why don't you call the president of the organization of 100 Black women? I said, great. So I called her, we became fast friends, and she said, I have made an arrangement for you to go and see Mr. Socorro, who's the president of the West Palm Beach City Council, and I think he'll give us $1,000 so we can have some startup money for this venture. And she said, I'll go and see him tomorrow. I said, okay. Following day, she calls me, she says, and she was a TV reporter. She said, I had to be out of town on assignment, so you got to go. So I went to the city council meeting, which was packed because they had some explosive topics on the agenda. And he said, we will now hear from Ms. Rosalind Murray, the president of the organization of 100 Black women. And I stand up, and there are a few surprised faces in the audience. So I said, Mr. President, I must confess that I am not a member of the organization, but I'm a very enthusiastic supporter, and I speak on their behalf for the occasion. And he said, just for that, you get $1,000. So we put on a big event there. And I had been involved with all kinds of international events throughout the years. One of them was in 1965, President Clinton decided to pick a trade war with Japan and to use something that was an understandable object of attack. He picked on luxury Japanese automobiles. I didn't have a Japanese franchise. I didn't have a dog in the fight, but I'd just been elected chairman of the American International Auto Dealers Association, and I was mad because I knew he didn't have coverage for attacking that particular industry. So I called the chairman of the Japanese auto importers in America and said, I'm going to Japan tomorrow morning. I'm taking 3 dealers who have these franchises, and 2 staffers, and we're going to Tokyo, and we're going to spend a week there to see if we can help resolve this behind the curtain. So I called Walter Mondale, who was the ambassador to Japan, and we had been friends for many years. His wife Joan and I were both on the board of McAllister together for many years, and Fritz, the vice president, came to all of our dinners and so forth. And he knew I was from Norway, so we were in. And so I called him, and he said, "Okay, as soon as you come in, come directly to the embassy residence at night when you land." And we went there, and he said, "This is my friend Kjell, and these are his folks. Introduce yourselves." And he said, "Now, Kjell, I want you to tell my team here, my political and my commercial attaché and our PR staff, what you're going to do." So I said, "Well, tomorrow at noon, I have a meeting with the chairman of Toyota, who is chairman of the Japan Auto Manufacturers Association, and the 4 other top chairmen and CEOs of Japan, of the Japanese auto industry." He said, "You do not?" I said, "I do." He said, "How the hell did you pull that off?" I said, "I told him I knew you." So he said, "This just might work." So he said, "Give Kjell your cell phone numbers and be available 24 hours a day." And he said, "Come with me to my office for a second." And he called the U.S. Trade Representative, Mickey Cantor, and he said, "I have my friend Kjell Bergh in the delegation here," and he explained the context. And he said, "Is it okay if I share what we have to make a deal?" I said, "Well, you got to do better than that. You also got to give me some fluff that I can throw away and to get them interested." So he got clearance to do that. And he later called President Clinton as well, cleared it with him. And we were fortunate enough to do some good work behind the curtain. We don't claim to have settled it. We claim to have been helpful in preparing the battlefield. And we had about 70 journalists, including a huge number of camera teams, following us around every day, wherever we went. And so we were on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, Newsweek, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, Aftenposten in Norway. We're all over the place. So it was a pretty heady time. So at the end, Mondale said, "This just could work." So he said, "Here are the 3 things to look for." And he gave us 3 specific things. He said, "If this, and this has happened by tomorrow night, midnight, we got a deal. And Mr. Cantor will stand up at the U.S., at the WTO trade negotiations in Geneva and announce that there's been a sudden and dramatic breakthrough in negotiations, for which reason I'm extending, or the president is extending the negotiating period by 24 hours. When you hear that, you know it's in the box. That's exactly what happened. So fast forward, and it was time to sign the treaty which settled this. Both Mr. Mondale and I were invited to the White House for the signing treaty. The heads of all of the American auto manufacturers were there. The Japanese ambassador and commercial attaché were there. None of the chairmen of the Japanese manufacturers were invited, which we both thought was pretty rude. Fast forward another year. In the meantime, and this touches on another relationship that I don't want to go too deep into, but I've taken care of the transportation for the royal family of Norway since 1968. And the king and queen were here in 1995, traveling from coast to coast. And I had borrowed Stan Hubbard's private jet to fly them around. And so I traveled with them. And the king and queen said, "We're fascinated with your background. We know you have a safari lodge in Tanzania." I said, "You're welcome to visit anytime." So we probably will say yes to that, but we booked 2 years out. No problem. So 2 weeks later, I was in Maui for a Volvo dealer meeting. I get a call from the palace. "Is the offer still open?" I said, "Yes." "Which year?" He said, "In 3 weeks." So, okay, yep, that's fine. So I flew directly from Honolulu to Dar es Salaam, set up a 7-day safari, a tented safari. And I asked the king if I could have permission to offer an official visit with the president and the cabinet of the United Republic of Tanzania? I said, of course. There'd never been a royal visit to Tanzania by a Scandinavian royal family before. And so as soon as I'd set up the trip, I called the president at home. I said, got a minute? Yeah, he said, come right on over. So he sat in the presidential palace and laid out the 2-day official visit. I flew to Oslo and told the king and queen, I said, look, it's all set. The only two things that are completely unnegotiable. And the queen, who's sort of the keeper of the fence lines, looked a little more serious. And she said, what might that be? I said, sunrise and sunset. Everything else is flexible. She said, oh, that sounds heavenly. And we had a marvelous time, just a marvelous time. Towards the end of that trip, and I was driving the entire royal family, and one of our staff drivers was driving my first wife and my two older kids in another Land Rover, but I'm driving the king and the queen, the crown prince and the princess. And I had arranged with the royal palace that they could call me at 7 o'clock in the morning any day, and I'd be in my Land Rover on a high frequency radio to relay messages. And I said, don't call at any other time unless it's urgent, because, as you know, this is a vacation for the royal family. So we're sitting in the middle of the Serengeti watching a lion kill. Alpha Delta Charlie paging Mr. Bergh. Alpha Delta Charlie paging Mr. Bergh. Urgent. Requesting permission to change to national transmission, meaning Norwegian rather than English. So I said, what's going on? And he said, well, I have a very sad message to convey to His Majesty. I wonder if you would convey it as soon as you can. So I said, stand by one. So I asked His Majesty whether he wanted to deal with it on the spot or whether I should pretend he wasn't there. He said, no, I'll take it. So he said, Your Majesty, I'm very sorry to inform you that this morning, in a terrible storm, the American Secretary of Commerce, Ron Brown, and a large delegation of American diplomats and businessmen have crashed in Bosnia, and they're all dead, standing by for your instructions on how to handle condolences. So from my Land Rover in the middle of the Serengeti, the king dictated condolence telegrams to Ron Brown's family and to President Clinton. And this was noon in Tanzania, which means 4 or 5 in the morning in Washington, D.C. So the only people that knew that this had happened at that time in America were the State Department, the Brown family, and a few other families afflicted, because it obviously hadn't hit the news yet. So fast forward, get back. The first voicemail I get is from Ron Brown's administrative secretary inviting Mr. Mondale and me. Fritz obviously got the same message to come to the first anniversary of the signing of the treaty, by which time the secretary had already passed. And the first letter I received was written invitation, hand signed by him. So a lot of these things come together full circle. So we were fortunate enough to handle the trade crisis, and we were fortunate enough that the king and queen and royal families safari came off without a hitch. And since then, we've done many other things. The Tanzanian government hired us to host President Carter and his family of 11. They stayed at our safari lodge. We've hosted Senator Rod Graham's, quite a few others there over the years, and it's been a great deal of fun to be involved with. So by now, I'm going to switch topics slightly, and Britt will put up another conversation starter. I have not been involved with either drugs or nuclear weapons, and I don't drink alcohol, so that's not the trigger point there. But I have spent a great deal of time in recent years working with the Air Force. And I just came back 3 weeks ago now from the northern islands in the northern Mariana islands in the Pacific, from the island of Tinian, from which both of the nuclear bombs that took out Hiroshima and Nagasaki were launched. Hence the nuclear reference. This came about, this was actually Donna and Michelle and I, and apologize for the tardy introduction here. My wife Donna is a 28-year military officer, a colonel in the Army National Guard in Minnesota for many years, and my daughter Michelle, they were with me, and this was in Singapore. We were there for an international policy conference with my grad school, the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. And we saw that sign in the store, and just couldn't resist. The military connection, and then I think we're getting closer to being able to give Lee some screen time here, is that I couldn't afford an electric train when I was a kid. So I said, well, when I get old enough, I'm going to get into some massive overcompensation. So since I made some money, I bought a 6-passenger brand new Piper high-performance retractable airplane, which I had for many, many years. And I've flown everything from World War II T-6 trainers and a Goodyear blimp to something that I'll show you in a few more minutes here. And that's a lot faster. But as a result of that, I got a call from General David Goldfein, 4-star general, chief of staff at the time for the United States Air Force, who asked if I would be interested in being a civic leader for the Air Force and later the Space Force when they stood that up. And I said, of course. So there are 35 of us that are active, plus a few others that are in emeritus status. And for us to be good ambassadors for the services, we have to know what we're talking about. So they fly us all over the world. One year it was the modernization of the nuclear triad, the land, air, and submarine, air, and land-based nuclear attack and defense from the United States. Another year it was, in fact, 2 years ago, it was our readiness to assist as required in Europe if something went badly with regard to Ukraine and a couple of other things in Europe. So we flew in the C-17 from Joint Base Andrews outside DC, 35 of us in the plane, where the captain told me that she, on her last flight out of Kabul, had 600 passengers in the same space. Where 35 of us were now sitting in much greater comfort. Flew to Ramstein Air Force Base in Germany, spent a couple of days there for command briefings. Flew to an air base in Italy, and for breakfast we had a command briefing at an air base in Italy. For lunch on the same day we had a command briefing at an air base in Hungary, and we ended up in Poland for dinner with a command dinner briefing in Poland, all in 1 week. And now, last month, we had a delayed trip that we had planned for about 6-7 months ago. We started out in Honolulu. Normally there's a C-17 waiting for us, but it seemed to be preoccupied with other orders at the time. So they rolled out the brand new Boeing 767 extended range airliner that they had chartered for us, because the distances in the Pacific are so enormous that only certain aircraft could handle it. So there were 35 of us, 5 flight attendants, and 7 military personnel, including a 3-star general, the woman who is the deputy commander of all Pacific Air Force for the United States in what is 62% of the sea area of the world. Terrific officer. Anyway, they flew our tight little group in the plane that had 250 seats, and the plane stayed with us the whole time. We flew from Honolulu to an air base just 26 miles west of Tokyo. Spent a couple of days there. Flew to Guam. Spent the day there for a command briefing. Switched to a C-130 and flew to the island of Tinian, as I mentioned, where the two nuclear devices took off from in B-29s. And that whole field had been, after we captured it from the Japanese, took it back, that whole field has been just overgrown. We're now in the middle of a $1 billion renovation, it's not classified, to make it available, much like we're spending $15 billion in Guam to make it available in the case of military intervention someplace in the Pacific. And you might think where that could be. So, and it was just a fascinating trip all the way around. Flew back from Tinian to Guam, hopped back in our big Bergh, and flew to Honolulu and back home to Minneapolis, all in 1 week. That's a lot of mileage. So now I'm realizing that I probably ought to work a little bit on slowing down. My wife says I'm not good at it. So Britt can throw up another picture. Last fall, just as I turned 80, the fighter squadron in Duluth treated me to a trip through the sound barrier in that F-16. There are not too many that get that kind of a treat. So I'm very honored. The Air Force doesn't pay us, but this is payback, big time. And I think I will leave it there, except to say that I've been incredibly fortunate in so many things. And when I first came to Minneapolis, I got a call to be a fellow at the World Press Institute for 4 months. I turned it down. I'd already bought the company. It wasn't convenient. So Reader's Digest, who was funding the institute, was intrigued. So they offered me a 50% scholarship at Macalester. And they said, you need to do this. I said, okay. So I worked full time while I was doing a BA in 2 years at Macalester. And I was married, and our first child was underway at that time, born a month and a half after I started, I think. And luck had it that Humphrey had lost the election, my luck, not his, and took a joint assignment at Macalester and the University of Minnesota, a joint professorship, but he lived at Macalester. And he handpicked the 15 people that he wanted for his senior seminars. And I was lucky enough to be one of them. And as soon as he figured out that I was from Norway and that I was a journalist and that I was a policy wonk, he would invite me and a few other folks over to his house on campus to talk politics until the cows came home. And then fast forward, Macalester wanted some of their tuition investment back. So they put me on the board for 12 years. And I served there with Joan Mondale and therefore became very friendly with Walter Mondale. And with Kofi Annan, finally, who we had the same setup. He was an African married to a Scandinavian. I was a Scandinavian married to an African. So we commiserated and shared strategies. And I actually met Kofi's wife and future mother-in-law probably 20 years before he did, because his mother-in-law was the half-sister of Raoul Wallenberg, who rescued thousands of Jews from Hungary. And she and Nana, Kofi's future wife, came to Minneapolis as guests of the Swedish Institute and Kurt Carlson. So Kurt invited me to join them for a private dinner at the Institute. And they came here to see if they could raise interest in getting the State Department to find Raoul because he had been arrested by the Soviets. And they wouldn't come clean until many, many years later on what they'd done. So anyway, Kofi and I became very good friends, and we had several occasions in which, at least for me, that became useful. The head of what was then the American Refugee Committee, Tony Koslowski, said, I desperately need to get the meeting with the Secretary General, but they won't put me on the books. Can you help me? So I called Kofi and I said, we're interested in talking about finding a solution to getting the landmine ban signed. Do you have an opening in the next 2 months? He says, tomorrow morning, 10:30, but you're coming too. So Tony and I flew to the UN, got some very, very helpful advice from the Secretary General. Fast forward, just before I turned 60, I was doing my master's at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. And about a month after we started, the UN mission in Baghdad was attacked, and 24 employees died, including the director of the UN in Iraq. One of my class members, the youngest one, 26-year-old woman from Argentina, was engaged to be married to the head of the UN operation. And she spent the last 3 hours of his life trying to dig rocks away to get to him before he passed away. Another friend of mine who is a member of parliament in Kenya now, a classmate, his wife was a British BBC television correspondent who was in the room and survived. And then he was later attacked by Al-Shabaab in Nairobi and was in the hospital for 2 years. And he's still active in Parliament. But anyway, those are the sort of things that happen when you're a car dealer in Minneapolis. And I'm honored that you would all share this time. If I went too long here, I apologize. Lee, you can have all the time you want to make up for it.
Thank you for your story. I have a couple of things I'm really quite interested. I think I've read that you wanted to come to America when you were very young.
Yes, absolutely.
What was the appeal?
So Norway was a socialist country at the time. It's now more of a free market country, but I wasn't particularly fond of the socialist system of governance, even though I understood the need for that in Norway after World War II with the scarce resources. So I was not an outspoken critic. I just was more comfortable in the American democratic setting and had read everything I could read about America, and I wanted to see it.
Okay. Well, it sounds like being an entrepreneur was Oscar Borton's idea, not your idea. Would you describe yourself as an accidental entrepreneur?
I would pretty much describe myself as an accidental everything.
Okay.
I've never had a plan. It's honest to goodness truth. The only thing I ever wanted to do was to learn to fly airplanes. So when I was 9 years old, I bicycled to the old airport in Oslo, 2 hours each way, just sitting there watching the planes take off and say, one day I'm going to learn to fly. I didn't have a plan beyond that. I just wanted to learn to fly. So every time something has hit me in the face, my approach is to make the best out of it. And that's always worked out reasonably well so far. And we're one of the largest and one of the 5 oldest Volvo dealers in America. And we're a $100 million enterprise with 1 location, so it's that's enough for 3 square meals.
That's excellent. Well, I think that one of the things I've read is that an appeal of America, you sort of said that a second ago, is that big rewards follow the acceptance of risk. That really wasn't a Norwegian way. Do you think that's an American cultural trait, this risk thing?
Yeah, I absolutely think it is. And not intending to be critical of Norway, it's just an observation. In Norway, and even much more so in Sweden, the tendency to be jealous of someone who does well is pretty strong. Whereas in America, if you do well when you're not expected to, you get a standing applause. And I like that much better. Yeah.
Great. At what point did you start thinking of yourself as Norwegian American or just old plain American?
Well, first of all, I became an American citizen in 1983, but I'd started to think of myself, and I had to give up my Norwegian citizenship at that point. I got it back 40 years later when the laws changed. But I had started to think in English. I'm thinking of myself as American much earlier than that. My first trip to America was in 65. I came back to live in 67.
Okay. Well, given your long and high-profile career, I'm sure you get asked for advice all the time from people from maybe Scandinavia or Europe. I'm sure what you say back depends a little on what's happening, but in general, what's your advice today about the opportunities in the United States?
Well, the first one is take it.
Okay.
And nothing starts unless you take the first step. So that's very important. The other one is that unlike me, I didn't really have a plan. If I had to do it over again, I would have structured my career in such a way that I would reinvest the money. And I probably spent more than I kept over the years because every time there was a new project, I was excited about trying it, you know.
Mhm.
So I imported prefabricated cabins from Norway. I started a big leasing company. I had a limousine company, all kinds of things, you know. I had a rustic resort in Norway, a safari lodge in Tanzania, and I enjoyed them. My point of attack was usually, if it sounds like fun, let's do it. That was the extent of the planning.
I wish I would have been a business salesman trying to sell you a business, because that sounds like a great attitude. So is Minnesota a good place to land for entrepreneurs and business owners seeking to?
So specifically, if you come from Minnesota, if you come from Norway, Lee, there can't be a better place than Minnesota.
Okay.
And I'm sure the folks from Borton would like to hear that.
Yeah.
And the reason is, people would say, isn't it hard for you to uproot yourself from your culture in Norway and come to Minnesota? I said, you have to be kidding. I said, if you have a bad accent and you come from Norway, it's like the second coming. and, and you get greeted with open arms. And that's exactly what happened. I hadn't been here for more than a year, I think, before I find myself sitting on the aft deck of Kurt Carlson's yacht, the Kurt C on the St. Croix, in the company of Don Gabbert and Carl Pohlad and the top leadership in the city of Minneapolis, where I had absolutely no business being. And the only reason I was there was that Kurt liked me, and we got along well. I think he saw something in me that I hadn't figured out yet. But anyway, very, very fortunate.
Okay. I know that I don't often miss my mom daily, but she would have really liked to hear me described as Norwegian American to you all. So my mom was very much Norwegian. And I've recently found out that I think second only to people of German descent, there's more Norwegians in Minnesota than any other ethnicity. So that's exactly what you described. This is a good place if you happen to be from Scandinavia.
It's actually an interesting story because I've been tracking that. I was on the board of the Swedish American Chamber and the Norwegian American Chamber, and for that matter, until December, I was chairman of the Tanzanian American Chamber nationwide. But anyway, because of that, I've been tracking these patterns and these polls. And the interesting thing is that when I came to Minnesota, the order of ethnic affiliation was German, Swedish, Norwegian. And someplace not too long after Norway found oil, the rankings changed. Swedish, Norwegian, Swedish. No, sorry. German, Norwegian, Swedish. And it turns out that that's because of all of the mixed marriages in Minnesota where one parent is Swedish and one is Norwegian. And so the ones that had previously declared themselves as Swedish all of a sudden decided that it would be much smarter to be Norwegian.
Oh, we're still not going to get any of the money, though. So, well, your automotive business is you're selling Americans an expensive product made by a Swedish-based company, majority owned by a Chinese firm. So about as global as things get.
Amen.
Thanks mostly to Mr. Trump, we've had a major disruption in global trade. Car business has been very much part of that. How has this affected your business, your car business, as well as overseas travel?
Well, I put a pencil to it the other day. Since Trump's infamously mislabeled Liberation Date,
Mhm.
when he imposed all of these scattershot, or that's not the correct word, but these broad tariffs all over the place. They used to be called duties when I first got into the business. For some reason, tariff sounds more palatable. Tariffs are weapons of mass destruction. If you have a duty that's applied surgically,
Mhm.
all countries do that. We do, Germany does, Norway does. When you put it across the board to everybody you don't like, bad problem. And what happens is entirely predictable, and that is that the companies that used to buy a lot of American defense equipment, scientific equipment, you can name it, steel, all kinds of things. They're now buying them elsewhere because you can't treat your best trading partners maliciously and expect that they're going to continue to buy our stuff. So I put a pencil to it the other day, and I figured that our sales have dropped by roughly $21 million in the last 12 months. And Bonnie Boisner, who runs our travel company, can attest to the fact that people are scared to make long-range travel plans now. So the inquiries are dropping off fast. Those Americans, no offense, I am one, are not particularly well known for geographic skills and understanding of other cultures. So when there's trouble in the Middle East, for some reason, you apparently don't think it's safe to go to Africa,
Mhm.
or in some cases to Norway. So that affects the travel company as well. And if I were to guess, I'd say that our sales by the end of the year will probably be off $3-4 million at the minimum.
Hmm. Are you optimistic that these things are temporary, that there'll be a bit of a snap back to a different kind of world?
So I'm an optimist by birth.
Mhm.
So the short answer is yes, with an asterisk. And the asterisk comes from the fact that I studied politics all my life, and I'm not partisan. I don't particularly care whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. I care whether the policies you're espousing make sense. So in order to understand what each side was working on, I spent a great deal of time at the Heritage Foundation and gave them a lot more money than I should have. And I spent a lot of time and money with the Democrats for the same reason, been very active behind the scenes
Mhm.
for both parties. I'm probably the only cat in the room, I'm going to guess definitely so, who was invited to Hillary Clinton's VIP suite election night at the Kravitz Center in New York. I was there. And shortly thereafter, I was an invited platform guest at Trump's first inauguration, and I was there. That just doesn't happen. But I make it the point of saying my presence is not an endorsement of any kind. I'm here to study and to learn what you're doing. And what I have learned, unfortunately, I can share this. My wife and daughter know that I'm about halfway through reading Hitler's Mein Kampf in the original German because I want to see how it aligns with Project 2025, which I've also read,
Hmm.
which is the blueprint of the extreme right wing of the Republican Party for what comes after Trump. So it's naive to assume that all of those plans are all of a sudden going to go away. That's a foolhardy proposition. And I know there are Democrats in the room, I know there are Republicans in the room. I only call the balls and strikes as I see them. And I have probably a little more inside information than a lot of folks that haven't had the opportunity to go to all of those gatherings and to get briefings by 3 and 4-star generals all the time and that sort of thing. And along those lines, I can tell you is a brief story. Congressman Pete Stauber from Duluth, the 8th district, is Republican. He's a good friend of mine. And he called me up And he said, I'd really like to get an appointment with the Secretary of the Air Force. It was Frank Kendall at the time. And can you fix that for me? So I called the secretary. I said, the Congressman Stober would like to have a meeting with you. And he says, okay, March 3rd, 12 o'clock, I'll serve, our staff serve lunch in my dining room, but you're coming too. So here you have a car dealer from Minnesota who had to arrange a meeting with the Secretary of the Air Force for a sitting member of Congress, which I thought was hilarious. So, and there's a funnier twist to that story as we show up, and this is a little while ago, as we show up at the Pentagon, we're walking up the steps and we see a marching band coming. And I said, Pete, no offense, but you're just a congressman. Why the marching band? He said, I don't get it. And then, so I look around the corner and I see that there's a motorcade waiting there. There's a Finnish flag on the corner of the lead car. And he was the president of Finland coming to meet with Pentagon leadership to discuss joining NATO. And so he wasn't for Pete. So they were just waiting for us to get out of the way.
So if short term there's not going to be a snapback, what adaptations are underway? What is Volvo or the global car businesses doing to adapt to this environment?
So it's terribly tricky, and it's not unique to just international nameplate manufacturers like Volvo. Both Ford and General Motors have lost substantially north of $1 billion so far as a result of the tariffs. And in the past 5 years, up until a year and a half ago, which I was tracking it, General Motors made and sold more cars in China than in the United States. Fact. And now they're trying to repatriate the production more and more to the United States. But both Ford and GM are also looking at new plants in Mexico. And one of the biggest partnerships in the auto industry was what was NAFTA, North American Free Trade Area, essentially. So you had Mexico, you had the United States, you had Canada. We have successfully managed to alienate both of them now. So it's getting harder and harder to make this work. In the case of Volvo, we used to have one factory in Sweden, one factory in Belgium, period, end of story. We now have factories in Sweden, Belgium, South Carolina, Korea. And as of the middle of next year, we're officially opening up a brand new plant in the First Lady's hometown. Hopefully that will get better treatment when it comes to tariffs. So what we're doing now is that we had to eliminate several models from the United States market because it was not economically feasible to sell them here. So our least expensive car, the entry-level car, the EX30, all electric, is no longer sold in America, even though we had long waiting list. And the top of the line car, the EX90, cannot be sold in America. It's our luxury sedan because the numbers don't work out because they're both, guess what, manufactured in China. And my take on this, if I can be a little bit political, is that during the Soviet Union days, we traded like mad with the Soviet Union, sold them all the agro products we possibly could, made as much money as we could from dealing with them, and then we competed head-on militarily. I think that's what we should do with China. We have a worldwide supply line for all products, all companies that can't be unraveled in a year or two. And I think we ought to make the most money we can trading with China and still compete as much as we possibly can on the military scale. Those are two separate compartments.
Thank you. Well, in light of all this, when you talk to Norwegians or other European people from Europe, are they less interested in investing in the United States than they were a couple of years ago? Or as best you can tell, how is America perceived where I don't usually go?
So there are two answers. The one is that people that are committed to investing in America are always going to do it regardless. And like clients of Borton and clients of the Norwegian Consulate General here and so forth, I think they're pretty much staying the course from my knowledge and planning to continue to invest here. But if you talk to a broader audience, and I've been to 85 countries and territories, and I always ask the same kinds of questions. And I have yet to find someone who thinks the way we're conducting our foreign policy makes a lick of sense overseas, period. Not a single one.
Well, I feel I should end on a more upbeat notion here. Are you a champion of doing business in the United States?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. 100%. And I haven't even told my family this, but yesterday I got an email from the guy who used to run our small rustic resort in Norway, Trollstigen Resort, which we sold when I was tired of doing battle with the local bureaucrats and where we're going to build a hotel on the site. And he said, our biggest competitor up the valley is retiring, and he wanted me to call you and see if you want to buy his place. No, not doing that. Been there, done that.
Well, thank you for that. Maybe we should have questions from the audience. So it looks like we have one right here. I think there's somebody with a mic, so make sure we get a chance to get a mic to you.
Well, thank you for this wonderful account of entrepreneurial endeavors throughout the world. And I'm happy to hear you're positive about investing in America. One issue of interest to those of us in Minneapolis is, and I'm sorry to hear that you had a poor experience with your business in the city of Minneapolis, but do you have any positive comments that could be made about business development in Minneapolis, like particularly downtown? And for instance, what advice might you have for our city council?
Very, very timely question. First of all, Donna and I just had dinner at McAllister College a week or so ago, and one of them who was there was Lisa McDonald, longtime city council member. And yesterday I got a letter from another city councilwoman, both of whom happened to be bragging about the service they get at Borton Volvo, but it was Lisa Goodman. I think that the bad rap that the city of Minneapolis and to a lesser extent the state of Minnesota have gotten from conservative circles outside of Minnesota is just that it's a bad rap. I think what happened first with George Floyd and then with what happened downtown and all the things that happened there, and later with the two people who were killed by ICE agents, were provoked unnecessarily so. As my two former colleagues from the Consular Corps can attest to, we have great relationship with ICE and other agents within the immigration enforcement and the federal enforcement system in Minnesota. In fact, I was keynote speaker at the annual Minnesota Federal Employees award dinner banquet one year and had great relationships with all of them. So let me put that in contrast with what happened over the past year. At the time, and there's a little caveat, there's been some years since I resigned as Honorary Consul, but at the time, when federal agents needed to arrest someone, they would do it in plain clothes, show their badge, and they said that we have some questions, would you kindly come with us? There were no helmets, there was no tear gas, there were no muscular weapons that scared the hell out of anybody, and everything worked out well. When I needed to visit with people, especially after 9/11, if you're a young black male and Muslim, you were going to be arrested. Doesn't matter if you hadn't done anything. That just happened as a knee-jerk response, understandably so, to 9/11 for a while things calmed down. So I spent, for the first time in my life, I had to visit Tanzanians in jail. Never had to do that before. So I spent time in Sherburne County Jail, Ramsey County Jail, Crone Detention Center in Miami. And I worked in about 15 states because the embassy wasn't funded to cover a large territory. So what happened here was unnecessary. It was provoked, and the result, unfortunately, I wouldn't say it was predictable, but the circumstances were such that you could see how it could happen. So that's very unfortunate. Now, when it comes to the city, I think that Mayor Fry is doing the very best he can under very difficult circumstances. And I think that I don't know the chief of police, don't have a dog in the hunt, I don't own the business in Minneapolis anymore. But I'd say that the chief is operating at about 55 or 60% of authorized sworn officer count. That's untenable. You just can't do that. You have to give the man the tools to do what he has to do. So we need to find a way to fund the police department properly and to recruit properly. We also need to spend more time understanding that whether it's federal or local law enforcement, there's a division between what I call cowboy cops and public servants. I happen to favor public servants. So I think we have to have an enlightened approach. For example, in Norway, it's only within the last year that policemen and women are authorized to carry guns all the time because it's deemed unnecessary. Sadly, it's becoming more necessary in some cities, Oslo being one of them. But they're incredibly carefully trained in how to use the weapons and when to reach the weapon. Just because you have a weapon doesn't mean you have to use it. If you got 5 men lying on top of a guy and you still find it necessary to shoot him, there's a problem with your logical reasoning. That's my personal opinion.
It's been a real pleasure listening to you today. But I wanted to ask, you must be a voracious reader.
I am.
And do you have a specific genre that you like or author that you like? Because I'm just interested where you've learned all this stuff.
So having been an unpaid diplomat for 15 years, I obviously read a lot of international policy documents and so forth. And my family and I have gone to policy conferences in places like Singapore, Talloires, France. And Admiral James Stavridis is a friend of mine. And I've traveled with him to the Baltic countries, meeting with the governments there. And I've traveled with him to Malta and to Geneva and so forth. So I've been incredibly blessed. So I read a lot of that kind of stuff. As my daughter knows, I don't watch horror movies, and I don't read books in that genre. Because I grew up playing in the German bunkers in Norway, left over from World War II. I'm fascinated with World War II history as it relates to Europe. Now, because I've just come back from this place where the 2 atomic bombs were launched from, I'm taking a great deal of interest in studying up on the Pacific War as well during World War II. And I read everything I could get my hands on about the Vietnam War for the same reason that it impacted public policy. When it comes to lighter reading in Norway, and I see in the bookshop here, Jon Nesbø has books in the bookshop. Jon Nesbø is a former investment advisor who, with his late brother, started a very popular rock band in Norway and is the most prolific crime writer in Norway. And he has some fabulous books. I have one at our place in the West Indies, in the Virgin Islands that I'm waiting to read when we get down there again. So I read those kinds of things, and I read everything I can find about the folks that were involved in World War II, working in the underground in Norway. And one of my closest friends for more than 30 years was Gunnar Sundsteby, number 24, who was the leader of the Oslo gang, and who stayed with Donna and Michelle and me for 8 days when we talked to him and his wife on the cotton to come over and give a talk at the International Film Festival when they chose to have Max Manus, the film about his gang, as the opening film at the festival. No, this is censored.
Hi, Dad.
Hi, honey.
So, one thing that there's a lot of echo, sorry. One thing that I've always really admired about you is that you have so much individuality and drive as a businessman. And I've heard, I don't know if this is true, but I've heard that in Scandinavia, sometimes there can be a culture of conformity, staying in the box, not doing anything too wild and out there. Maybe I'm wrong. But I've always wondered, since you grew up having those more stereotypically American qualities with venturing out and trying new things with business, I've always wondered what sparked that for you, or what qualities really motivated you to go out and do something different and try things that maybe weren't normal where you grew up. What was that gave you that confidence to try all of those new things?
Michelle, that's an amazing question. I actually have thought a lot about that. And part of the answer, after World War II, when both my mother's family home and my father's family home burned to the ground as a result of the German bombing of Kristiansund, where I was born, my grandparents on my mother's side ended up buying a small hobby farm. To make ends meet, they couldn't live off the farm. My grandfather worked as a carpenter in the rebuilding of the city of Kristiansund, and my mother and her cousin, who was roughly the same age, stayed at the farm and farmed it. For some reason, from the time I was about that tall, Sigvart, who was my grandmother's cousin, took me under his wings. And when it was time for me to start elementary school, they told my parents, no, don't send this kid to, and I don't mean to brag, don't send this kid to school. He's way too smart. Leave him with me and I'll teach him everything he needs to know. And among the things that I learned through him, and I didn't practice that part, but he brewed his own moonshine, and he was a good marksman. So at age 9, he gave me a high-power rifle, not a .22, a high-power rifle, told me how to break it down, reassemble it, and how to reload my spent cartridges. And he and I would shoot 100-meter target practice whenever he wasn't working at the farm. He taught me how to set 100-hook lines when I was 9 or 10 to go out in my little wooden rowboat in the fjord and get fish and sell it. I was, in addition to selling Coke, I was selling fish to the mink farmers, and also how to set nets. So that taught me how to be an individualist. And I wanted to test that. So when I was 13, I took my bicycle, which didn't have any gears, a heavy metal bike, tent, 2-burner little gas stove, and a sleeping bag, and about $10. And I bicycled from my grandparents' place back to Oslo in 3.5 days. It was 360 miles, all alone, and on mostly gravel roads in those days. And so I figured out what my limits were, and there weren't very many. Little by little, I kept expanding the limits. A few years later, I hitchhiked from Paris to Oslo alone. And I wouldn't let any of my kids do that these days. They're different times. But I enjoyed testing myself. So hope that answer the individuality, but you're right about conformity. And again, particularly in Sweden, that's a very big thing in the corporate world too, is that you're governed by consensus. Wonderful when things are going well. When things are not going well, not a good business model, because somebody has to make the tough calls.
Kjell and Lee, thank you so much. This has been a fascinating conversation. Christina?
Thank you so much, Kjell, for sharing your story, and Lee for being here. We have these beautiful Viking ale bowls that we want to give to you as a thank you. Traditional Scandinavian symbol for community celebration and coming to one table for peace and togetherness. And they are made locally here in Minnesota. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you to all of you for coming today. It's just great to see you all. Our mission here is to connect with contemporary Norway through arts, business, and culture. And this falls into our Business Barn program. We have a few board members. We have our Sandy Weiss, our board chair is here. Christine Schultz is here as well. And I see Jim Farsa, but he just left. Thank you all for coming. We have a lot of great programs coming up next week. The Minnesota Peace Initiative is next Wednesday. On Thursday, we're actually live streaming from the Royal Palace. There's Fosse. John Fosse is an author there. We'll be giving a lecture. And then Peter Guy will be here as well. And then at noon, Don Pigneri is coming from Seattle, A Coat Dyed Black. And that's on the resistance in Norway during World War II. So that'll be another fascinating program. And we do this all from membership. So please, if you're not a member here at Norway House, please consider becoming a member. And sponsors such as Susanne Ojo, who sponsored all the food here today, thank you, and is also part of the Barn Committee. We wouldn't do this without you. So thank you so much. Tusen takk, as we say. And come again. And we'll see you in October for the next conversation series with Janet Dolan. Thank you.